Well, Leslie, thank you so much for joining us to talk about your story and your mother's story, and just kind of the miraculous things that happen, around your birth, and getting your family from Europe to Canada. And I wanted to sit down with you, especially as we prepare for International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and get your story. And it's always important, I think, that that people hear it afresh, so that they know, what has transpired, and so that it never happens again. So let me just kind of start us off. Can you, for our listeners, can you tell us about your mother's journey from Hungary, where she met your father, and then through the war years at Auschwitz and at the subcamp at Dachau, and ultimately to Canada, where your family landed and where you were raised?
Well, sure. Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate the opportunity for telling my mother's story and my story. It's just coincidentally her 5th anniversary of her passing will be this February the 16th. Mm. So it's apropos. Mm-hmm. So in her we say in Hebrew, her zechut, in her merit. Mm-hmm. This is her story, and I'll hopefully that it will convey some of the experiences that I've had in growing up with this story. Mm. I've talked about this to children, grade 7 and grade 8 students in schools, and the first question I ask always is, how many of you have birth certificates? Of course, everybody puts their hand up. We have birth certificates. And do you remember what hospital you were born in? Yes, we do. And the doctors? Oh, yes, we know the doctors. Mm-hmm. I said, well, in concentration camp, I didn't have a birth certificate. In fact, they didn't have birth certificates, and they didn't have death certificates. Mm. On my passport, the only thing that even comes close is the fact that it says my place of birth is Kaufering, Kaufering, mm-hmm. DEU, which is Deutschland, and the date, February 20th, 1945. So on its own, it seems pretty sterile. Mm-hmm. Like saying North York, Ontario, Canada, which is a suburb of Toronto.
Right.
But what isn't mentioned is Kaufering, Lager 1, a concentration camp. There were 11 subcamps of Dachau, and I was born in Lager number 1. My mother was the youngest daughter among 14 brothers and sisters, born in 1922 in Komarno, Czechoslovakia, to a family rich in Torah values. Her mother would send her brothers back to synagogue on Shabbat if they did not bring someone home for a Shabbat meal. Mm-hmm. She would say there must be someone in synagogue needing a Shabbat meal. Their home was open to yeshiva students who needed a place to stay. Her father encouraged yeshiva students and rabbis to gather wheat from his farm and prepare flour to make matzat for Passover. Matzat is unleavened bread. Her parents' farm was used to train pioneers in the use of farm equipment, how to farm and raise livestock in preparation for Aliyah, going to Palestine in the 1930s. Her mother literally gave away her husband's clothing to the needy. No questions were asked. Mm. My parents met via a matchmaker. My mother came from her hometown in Czechoslovakia and stayed at her sister in Budapest. My father lived in Hungary, not far from Budapest, in a small city called Szentpéter, and went there to meet her. After several meetings, they became engaged and quickly planned their wedding in 1943. My mother's family tried to dissuade the marriage because of the dangerous situation, but to no avail. They were in love, and the marriage would proceed. My father sent his own non-Jewish worker to Komarno, Czechoslovakia, to smuggle my mother to Miskolc, Hungary, to be married, a distance of more than 400 kilometers. The border between Czechoslovakia and Hungary was closed. She was smuggled into Hungary on a passenger train disguised as a Christian mute. She wore a big cross around her neck, black clothing, and a veil around her head to reduce suspicion. Mm. This was a treacherous mission. If discovered, instant death would follow. Now, no one from my mother's family was at the chuppah, which is the wedding. It took place on the evening of April the 5th, 1944, a Wednesday, 3 days before Passover. Are you crazy getting married now? Nazis all around? That day was the very day of the Yellow Star. In a show of defiance, she pinned a red rose over the big yellow star on her dress. But they were in love, and que sera, sera. What will be, will be. They lived together in the Miskolc ghetto until June. In June 1944, they were separated, and my father was taken to the Carpathian Mountains as a slave laborer. My mother was taken with thousands of other Jewish prisoners stuffed into cattle cars to Auschwitz, a journey lasting several days, well over 400 kilometers. There was a little hole high up on the cattle car wall close to the ceiling to allow fresh air for the normal cargo of cattle. But crammed with hundreds of people and stench, it was not enough. People climbed on each other to try and get a breath of fresh air. When the doors finally opened in Auschwitz-Birkenau, many had already succumbed to the squalor, filth and hunger, having been locked up with little or no food or water for many days. My mother found herself appearing before Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, for the selection process. Healthy and strong, she went to the right and lived for another day. Pregnant mothers and babies and the weak were sent to the left and to the gas chamber and death. He was also looking for twins to do terrible experiments. Everything happened quickly. Schnell, schnell, shouted the SS guards with their barking dogs. There were 2 lines, one for death, one to live another day. Jewish prisoners in striped uniforms ran to the trains and cried in German, "Gib der Kinder zu der Mama." Give the babies to the grandparents, or you will be smoke coming from those chimneys. They had come to tell the newly arriving mothers that by giving their children to their mothers or mothers-in-law, at least the parent would be saved. The grandmothers with the babies went to the left and to the gas chambers and eventually the crematorium. If the mothers held on to their children, they too would both be gassed. Heads were shaved and the hair was piled in heaps by color of hair. Clothes and shoes were replaced with a striped gown, no underwear, and wooden shoes. Numbers were tattooed on their arms. The Germans were dehumanizing the people, hoping to bring them to the level of animals. My mother was young, healthy, and beautiful. Prisoners who had been in Auschwitz a long time told her to get onto work groups that left Auschwitz. Get out of here if you can. At the beginning of July 1944, she was taken to Plaszow, a forced labor camp in Poland, again by a cattle car, a distance of 100 kilometers from Auschwitz. Then one day, she felt something moving in her belly and asked, "What's happening to me?" And only then realized that she was pregnant. If discovered, death was certain. How to hide it? She exchanged her prisoner gown with another woman for a larger size to help hide her pregnancy. I was terribly scared and felt so alone. I was so hungry. Every day, so hungry, she said. Her mother's face and her husband's smile began to fade in her memory. Her thoughts are starting to become dull. Now she must not only fear for her life, but also for that of her baby. My mother was very lucky. There was a Polish-Jewish couple named Heinrich Reichsfeld. A kapo is a concentration camp prisoner appointed by the SS guards to supervise forced labor. He needed 20 women in his squad to search through pillows and blankets of deported and murdered Jews. They would search for gold and jewels. He said to my mother, "I chose you because you look like my daughter. She is dead." Somehow, he knew that my mother was pregnant. He snuck in a piece of sausage, cheese, bread, and potatoes, and even once a boiled egg, something unthinkable in a concentration camp. This man was an exception among the many brutal kapos of Plaszow. At the beginning of August 1944, Plaszow is evacuated because the Allies are advancing and prisoners are returned to Auschwitz. Again, my mother was marched before Mengele for the selection process, and again, miraculously sent to the right. She told me that the Germans put bromine in their food and water. This chemical prevented women from menstruating, and that also made their stomachs swell. This also helped hide her pregnancy. Then one day, at roll call, an SS officer offered double portions of food to all pregnant women that would step out of line. My mother didn't. She felt that her mother sent her a message that it was a trick and not to step out. Sure enough, over 50 pregnant women stepped out, and they were all gassed. In September 1944, my mother was sent to work in Augsburg, Germany, almost 900 kilometers away in a Messerschmitt factory, making parts for airplanes. There were 500 other women and political prisoners there. One day she noticed through the window an apple tree, and being pregnant and always hungry, asked a fellow political prisoner who had more freedom to get around if he could pick it for her. He did and hid it in the latrine. She retrieved it and savored every bite. The situation in Augsburg was not great, but much better than in Auschwitz. In December of 1944, 2 German officers, while on a routine inspection, discovered her pregnancy. My mother was 7 months pregnant. Ah, du bist schwanger, du Schwein. Oh, you're pregnant, you pig. We are taking you back to Auschwitz for extermination. The 2 Germans and my mother traveled together on a regular passenger train, with German citizens all properly attired. At one stop, when the German officers went out for a smoke, the lady opposite my mother asked, "Was passiert?" What's happened to you? My mother, for the first time, saw her own reflection. She looked like a monkey, shaved head and skinny as a rake, wearing inmate clothing with the big letters KZ on the back, Katze. Don't you know, she said, they're killing Jews. The 2 SS officers returned and said, you are lucky. Auschwitz is being bombed. You are being turned over to the concentration camp in Kaufering, and Kaufering consisted of 11 subcamps of the main camp, Dachau. Kaufering prisoners were used as slave laborers to build huge underground bunkers. These had cement walls several feet thick. These caverns were used to build the German Messerschmitt planes. Upon entering the barracks, which were triangular or domed in shape and partially underground, my mother discovered 6 other pregnant Hungarian women who were placed there from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. They hugged each other and cried. Why these other mothers were there to begin with is a mystery. They called themselves the Schwanger Kommando, the pregnant battalion. They worked in the laundry and the kitchen. In December of 1944, the pregnant mothers began delivering their babies. All were healthy babies. Birgit Legman, the eldest of the mothers, delivered first. It was freezing cold, and Lupa, the capo, smuggled a small wood stove into the barracks to provide heat. She was discovered and beaten to a pulp by the SS officers. And guess what? She brought another stove in the very next day and stood up to these officers. My mother was the last of the 7 mothers to deliver. Dr. Vadash, a gynecologist prisoner from the men's side, was sent to help in the deliveries. He had no instruments, no water, nothing but his frail body. My mother had terrible labor pains for 48 hours. Dr. Vadash kept yelling, "Push, Miriam, push, you have to push." My mother had no strength. Dr. Vadash lay on top of my mother and forced all his weight on her abdomen. And while shouting encouragement and pushing, my mother finally gave birth. I weighed almost 4.5 kilograms, bright blue eyes, and golden blonde hair. I looked like an Aryan. The German officers joked that maybe she had relations with the German. A few days later, my mother developed a high fever and started to bleed very badly. The placenta did not come out. This became an emergency. Dr. Vadash did a scraping with his bare hands. She came very close to dying at that very moment. My mother was so sick and weak and could not breastfeed me. Birgit, the first mother to deliver, nursed me and whoever else among the other babies that required it. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was determined to exterminate all Jewish children. Himmler's famous speech on October the 6th, 1943 at Posen in Poland declared, "We came to the question, how is it with the women and children? I decided to find a solution here as well. I did not consider myself justified to exterminate just the men, that is, to kill them or have them killed, and allow the avengers of our sons and grandsons in the form of their children to grow up. The difficult decision had to be taken to make the people disappear from the earth. So, in October of 1943, Himmler ordered the extermination of pregnant women and children. 1.5 million babies and children were murdered by the Nazis, and 7 healthy babies were born in a concentration camp. Hitler wanted the complete annihilation of the Jewish race. The American army was converging, and on April 27th, the Nazis began evacuation of the subcamps and forced prisoners to march or put them in open train cars to Dachau, the main concentration camp, where the plan was to gas everyone. A German soldier, seeing my extremely weak mother, offered to carry me. My mother asked him why. He replied, "You remind me of my daughter." My mother was able to get on a coal car behind the steam engine with me bundled in rags heading to Dachau. The train was mistakenly attacked and bombed by Allied air forces, not knowing that it was transporting prisoners from the various concentration camps. The engine was disabled, and my mother, thinking this was the end, jumped off the coal car and ran into the woods. A new engine was brought to replace the bombed out one, and prisoners were rounded up, and those that tried to escape were shot. The train continued through the city of Dachau with its human cargo and stopped in the city. There was no room in the camp to unload. They were not killing fast enough. Prisoners in Dachau were being slaughtered because the Nazis knew that the end of the war was nearing, and they wanted to kill as many as they could. In the early morning of April 29th, 1945, Dachau was finally liberated by the American army. After seeing nothing but death all around, the soldiers could not believe their eyes when they saw 7 mothers with their babies. Even at liberation, many prisoners died because of disease, such as typhus. Also, starving prisoners were given too much to eat too quickly. Before being separated, my parents planned that if they survived, they would each return to their city. After regaining strength, my mother was driven by jeep with a doctor and a nurse to Prague and stayed for 2 to 3 days, then on to Bratislava, and then to her home in Komarno. The news of my mother and baby reached my father in Hungary. He immediately traveled to Komarno, and so it was they met. My father was shocked to see his wife with a blue-eyed, blonde-hair baby. My mother said, "It's ours. He has your ears." Those that survived the Holocaust began to realize the extent of the disaster that befell them and their families and slowly started to put their lives together. In most cases, nothing remained of complete families or property, and survivors looked abroad. My mother's sister left Europe before the war and with her husband settled in Bowmanville on a small farm near Toronto, and it was to Toronto that my parents would eventually come. Before finally leaving on the ocean liner, the SS Washington from France, they spent several months in Barbizon, an area close to Paris, in shelters that were arranged by an organization that rescued Jewish orphaned children. We spent several months in Barbizon, France, and then sailed to New York. The entry papers were not in order, and we ended up in Cuba for about 6 months, waiting for our visa. In 1947, we finally arrived to Toronto.
Wow. And it's amazing because, you know, there were so many times in your mother's journey where, like, she's being marched around and she's being sent here and things are getting bombed. And so often she shouldn't have made it, but she did. You know, her whole life, and your life too, for that matter, is just miraculous.
She was obviously, you know, there's a lot of the hand of God was there. There's no question about that. People have asked her, how can you believe in God? People have died, and it was horrible. And her answer was simply, I brought a baby back from hell. So it was. It's a very personal thing, obviously. So everybody has a different take on this, and this was her. And she came from a religious background, as my father did as well. And this is, having emunah, as we say in Hebrew, having faith, and this is, I think, what carried them through this the terrible time.
Yeah, and your father became a rabbi. Was it after the war when he landed in Canada, or had he become a rabbi before leaving Europe? Or
no, he wasn't. He was a very well educated man, and he got a position when we came to Toronto in 1947, they were working at whatever they could get. They had stuffing mattresses in a factory. My mother was doing some work in sewing. Eventually, an opportunity arose that my father would become a teacher and a rabbi in a small city north of Toronto called Timmins. Timmins is like a mining town. It's about 600 miles. If you think Toronto's cold, Timmins is close to the North Pole.
Wow.
Anyway, we were there for 2 years, and he became the rabbi there in the city and a teacher. And then from Timmins, they moved to a place called Sudbury. And then Sudbury finally ended back in Toronto, where my parents opened up a bookstore in 1966, selling Judaica, and which they had for 40 years.
Yeah, it's like a landmark there in Toronto, Miriam's Judaica, right? I mean, it's quite the establishment for sure. Now, if you don't mind my asking, like, how did your mother come to peace with this? And also, like, your father, how did he maintain his faith, despite the horrors that he saw as well?
It's hard to put this not the simple answer. The only thing that comes to mind is the fact that they were believers in God and believers in the fact that whatever was destined to happen was a plan, the master plan. And we can't understand the master plan, but we have to abide by it. And whether good or bad in the way we see things, it's always good in the eyes of God. So in some sense, that's, I think, how he reconciled, or that's how it was reconciled. On the other hand, my mother's brother lost his wife and children, and he totally went the opposite way. I mean, and they came, and again, my mother and her brother came from the same family, saw the same upbringing, saw the same, but they had a different view of things. So, I mean, it's very difficult to give a cause, or why this and why that. But
No, I understand.
Yeah.
Now, so you were the last of the 7 Kaufering babies to be born.
Yes.
So I don't know, but it's quite possible that you're the youngest Holocaust survivor in the world, or definitely at least one of the youngest, if not the youngest. How old were you when you learned the amazing story of your birth, and how did you process all that?
That's a very good question. I was probably in my early 20s when my mother, I remember as a youngster hearing about certain things but really, it's like way over your head. It didn't register. And when I was in my 20s, I started really hearing more and more about it. And I was being called, from time to time, a dirty Jew, where we lived up north, and I didn't understand that. And I started asking questions, and I started listening to the stories my mother was telling me, and especially people were starting to write about it. So not only did I hear it from my mother, but I started reading about it. And I think that's when it certainly made an impression on me, what was really happening. And the processing of it is still going on in my head. I think the way I look at it, I was there in body, but not in mind. I mean, everything that I know is only what was told to me.
Right.
So I have no firsthand feeling of it, although if you can, as a baby in a womb, how much was pushed through to me. Again, it's a very difficult position for me to be in. It's like I said, I'm still processing it. Many times I go on the internet and I look at these horrible pictures to say that I was in a place like that.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. And in fact, in 2010,
Mm-hmm.
The 6 babies and myself had we reunited in Dachau for the 65th commemoration of Dachau.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing because here we are, the 7 babies getting together for the first time in 65 years. What a feeling! What a feeling that was.
Yeah, that's just, I mean, another miracle, right? I mean, just the fact that you all made it, it's just astounding.
And Brigitte, I think I mentioned that Brigitte Legman, who was the mother that nursed me,
Mm-hmm.
my mother looked for her after the war. She spent 25 years looking for this lady through the Red Cross and finally found her in Brazil, Sao Paulo.
Mm.
And actually invited her to our wedding in Toronto in 1972, to which she came. And it was very, very emotional and very, very beautiful.
So let me ask you, your parents have gone through, I mean, unbelievable experience and come out on the other side, and they have survived, they have lived, they're raising their family. And what are some of the things that they taught you growing up, about charity and tolerance and overcoming evil with love?
All of those. In fact, if I can read this is I think encapsulates who my mother was and who my parents were, and what was passed down to my generation and what I hopefully passed on to my kids' generation.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote this. This was in 2010, as I mentioned before. There was the 65th commemoration of the liberation of Dachau, which she did not attend, but she made a homemade video, and she made a speech. And this is what she said, if I can read it.
Yes, please.
I would like to send greetings to the staff at the Dachau Museum, to all survivors of Dachau and its subcamps from all countries and their families. I would also like to send greetings to the young generation, to the dignitaries, to students of the Holocaust, and to the German citizens, Jews and non-Jews, who are attending today. I would like to thank Eva Gruberova and Sabine Scham, the curators of the exhibition. I would like to thank Mrs. Gabrielle Hammerman for making the project possible and for inviting our children to participate in this overwhelming milestone. I would like to send special greetings to the 7 children born in Kaufering who have gathered here from Canada, Brazil, Israel, Slovakia, Hungary, to Hannah, Marika, Judith, Agi, George, Yossi, and my son Leslie. We were 7 Lagerschwester, women who were like sisters, although we were strangers. We helped each other. The SS called us the Schwanger Commando. Only Eva Fleischmanova in Slovakia and I, in Canada, remain today. The other 5 women were Elizabeth Legman, who saved my son's life, Suri Hirsch, Dora Lowy, Magda Schwartz, and Iboya Kovac. Our children are at this memorial today to represent us. The gathering today is a memorial to those who perished. The American Army liberated 7 mothers and our babies in Dachau on April 29, 1945. Until today, I don't know why we were spared, why we were kept alive when 1.5 million Jewish children were killed by the Nazis. The Americans couldn't believe what they saw in the midst of so much death. 7 babies. I send this message to the people of Germany, especially the young people, also politicians, educators, clergy. We must learn how to understand other suffering nations of the world. We must practice tolerance, accept our differences, skin color, religion. We are all God's children. The young people must fight for democracy. Take an example from the young people of Iran. Because they wanted democracy, thousands of them were killed. Don't be afraid to speak up. Don't be complacent. You have an example with Hitler, who poisoned the people and taught them to hate and blame the Jews for everything. People believed him. I pray and hope that in your generation, the world will change. Thank you for listening to my message, and it was delivered Toronto, January 2010. So what she said here basically is understanding, tolerance, education. Don't be ignorant. If you have any questions, learn about something. Just don't take things at face value, and dig. to understand what went on.
Mm.
I think that's the lesson for that I heard, that I've been taught, and like I said, I'm passing this on to my children as well.
Wow. Well, Mr. Rosenthal, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your story, your mother's story, a remarkable tale of courage and bravery and love and frankly miracles, lots of miracles to make this happen. So I really just want to let you know how much I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for sharing all this with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me.